The 1960s wasn't just about Psycho, 2001, and The Graduate. Hidden behind these giants were mind-blowing masterpieces that vanished into obscurity. Films where Hollywood legends played their most daring roles, where groundbreaking techniques changed cinema forever, and where stories were so ahead of their time that audiences simply weren't ready. These forgotten gems will make you rethink everything you thought you knew about 60s filmmaking. Number 15. Second, 1966. Ever wonder what would happen if you could completely erase your identity and start over? Seconds goes there, and it's one of the most disturbing identity crisis thrillers ever filmed. Rock Hudson, yeah, the romantic comedy guy, delivers the performance of his career as a middle-aged banker who pays a mysterious organization to fake his death, give him a new face, and set him up with a completely new life as a successful artist. Director John Frankenheimer creates a paranoid nightmare using fisheye lenses, disorienting angles, and some of the most claustrophobic camera work of the decade. The black and white cinematography by James Wong Howe is absolutely revolutionary. He literally strapped cameras to actors' bodies during a wild, hallucinatory wine festival sequence that feels more like experimental art than Hollywood filmmaking. What makes Seconds truly haunting is how it dismantles the American dream. Hudson's character gets everything he thinks he wants, only to discover that changing your face doesn't change your soul. The film bombed spectacularly upon release. Audiences expecting typical Rock Hudson charm instead got existential horror. Paramount basically buried it, but directors from Soderbergh to Aronofsky cite it as a major influence, and its themes about identity, appearance, and starting over feel shockingly relevant today. The final scene, where Hudson realizes the horrifying truth about the rebirth process, delivers one of cinema's most chilling endings that will stay with you for days. Number 14. Petulia, 1968. Richard Lester's Petulia feels like the 60s counterculture shot directly into your veins. This fractured, kaleidoscopic tale of an affair between a recently divorced doctor and an eccentric, abused socialite captures the disorienting spirit of San Francisco during the summer of love like nothing else. The film's revolutionary editing technique, jumping back and forth through time without warning, was mind-blowing for 1968. One second you're at a charity ball, the next you're witnessing domestic violence, then suddenly you're at a concert featuring the Grateful Dead, all cut together like a fever dream. Nicholas Roeg, who would later direct Don't Look Back, was the cinematographer, and his vibrant, hypnotic visuals make even mundane moments feel electric. Petulia didn't just push cinematic boundaries, it tackled taboo subjects like domestic abuse and emotional emptiness during the free love era. Critics were divided, with Roger Ebert calling it cold and unforgiving, while others hailed it as a masterpiece. The film essentially vanished after its release, caught between traditional audiences who found it confusing and hippies who found its critique of counterculture uncomfortable. Richard Lester created something truly unclassifiable here. Part romance, part social commentary, part experimental film. And the result is a time capsule that somehow feels more authentic than any documentary about the era. When Scott's character wanders through a scene of hippies being beaten by police while Janis Joplin wails in the background, you're not just watching the 60s, you're experiencing its contradictions firsthand. Number 13. The Hill, 1965. Forget James Bond. The most intense Sean Connery performance you've never seen is in The Hill. Set in a British military prison in North Africa during World War II, this brutal drama follows prisoners forced to march up and down a man-made hill in the scorching desert heat until they break. Connery plays a former sergeant major court-martialed for refusing to lead his men into a suicide mission, now subjected to sadistic punishment by officers more dangerous than any enemy. Director Sidney Lumet shot the film in stark black and white, with relentless close-ups that capture every drop of sweat, every moment of suffering. The cinematography is so visceral, you'll find yourself reaching for water just watching it. There are no music cues to tell you how to feel, just the sounds of boots on sand, labored breathing, and men being broken down. The film was a commercial failure despite winning the Best Screenplay Award at Cannes. Audiences expecting Connery's Bond charm instead got a harrowing portrait of institutional cruelty and psychological torture. The studio buried it, unsure how to market such an uncompromising vision. Harry Andrews delivers one of cinema's most terrifying villains as the regimental sergeant major, a man who believes in breaking soldiers for their own good. Veterans have consistently praised The Hill as one of the most accurate depictions of military psychology ever filmed. Its unflinching examination of power, authority, and resistance feels shockingly modern. The climactic riot sequence, filmed in a single, chaotic take, stands as one of the most intense moments in 60s cinema. When Connery finally fights back against his tormentors, it's not heroic. It's desperate, messy, and utterly human. Number 12. The Swimmer, 1968. The Swimmer is what happens when the American dream drowns in its own backyard pool. Burt Lancaster, in perhaps his most daring role, plays Ned Merrill, a seemingly successful suburban man who decides to swim home across his wealthy Connecticut neighborhood by using all his neighbors' swimming pools. What begins as a quirky adventure gradually unravels into something profoundly disturbing. Director Frank Perry creates a suburban nightmare that gets darker with Yosemite each pool. Lancaster, at 55 and in incredible physical shape, performs his own stunts and spends most of the film in nothing but swim trunks, physically exposed while his character becomes emotionally stripped bare. The film was actually shot over 2 years, with Sidney Pollack secretly brought in to reshoot several scenes, creating a disjointed feeling that perfectly mirrors the protagonist's fractured reality. Critics were baffled upon its release, and audiences largely ignored it. Columbia Pictures had no idea how to market this strange allegory about affluence and delusion. But The Swimmer has developed a devoted cult following, with filmmakers like Get Out's Jordan Peele citing its influence on suburban horror. The film's genius lies in how it gradually reveals the truth. With each swimming pool Ned visits, another piece of his carefully constructed fantasy crumbles. We slowly realize this isn't the story of a successful man having a whimsical adventure. It's the journey of someone who has lost everything but can't face reality. When Lancaster finally reaches his abandoned, foreclosed home in the pouring rain, the emotional gut punch is devastating. Nothing in 60s cinema captures the hollowness behind the perfect suburban facade quite like this forgotten masterpiece. Number 11. Mickey 1, 1965. Warren Beatty as a paranoid nightclub comedian on the run from the mob in a surrealist nightmare directed by Arthur Penn. Mickey 1 is what happens when American filmmakers discovered French New Wave and cranked it to 11. This bizarre, jazz-infused fever dream follows a stand-up comic who may or may not have angered the Detroit Mafia, forcing him to flee to Chicago and live in constant fear. The film feels like Kafka and Fellini got together to make a gangster movie. Penn uses expressionist lighting, documentary-style street scenes, and abstract imagery to create a uniquely American art film. There's a sequence with a car crusher that looks like it came from a David Lynch movie 20 years before Lynch became famous. The black and white cinematography by Ghislain Cloquet is so stylized that ordinary Chicago locations feel like alien landscapes. Mickey 1 was an absolute commercial disaster upon release. Critics called it pretentious, audiences found it impenetrable, and Columbia Pictures basically dumped it after a brief run. Beatty himself reportedly distanced himself from the project. But the film's reputation has grown steadily over decades, with directors like Martin Scorsese and Paul Thomas Anderson citing its influence. What makes it so fascinating today is how it captures American paranoia years before Watergate made conspiracy theories mainstream. Mickey never knows if he's actually being pursued or if it's all in his head, a perfect metaphor for Cold War anxiety. The film's jazz score by Eddie Sauter and Stan Getz is a character unto itself, with frantic saxophone solos underscoring Mickey's psychological breakdown. The climactic performance art sequence, featuring a self-destroying machine called Yes, remains one of the strangest finales in American cinema. Number 10. Shock Corridor, 1963. Samuel Fuller's Shock Corridor is cinematic dynamite, a pulp masterpiece that smuggles scathing social commentary into what appears to be a trashy B-movie. The premise is pure exploitation. A journalist fakes mental illness to get committed to an asylum so he can solve a murder and win a Pulitzer. But what unfolds is a descent into genuine madness that doubles as a blistering critique of 1960s America. Fuller, a former crime reporter and WW3 veteran, shoots the film like he's reporting from the front lines of insanity. The black and white cinematography occasionally erupts into color hallucination sequences. The asylum becomes a microcosm of America itself, with patients representing the nation's deepest wounds: racism, nuclear fear, and war trauma. The film's most shocking scenes involve a character who was captured in Korea and brainwashed, now believing himself to be a Confederate general fighting for white supremacy. Another patient is a nuclear physicist who's regressed to childhood after helping create weapons of mass destruction. These weren't subtle metaphors in 1963. They were narrative grenades. Shock Corridor was condemned by mainstream critics as tasteless exploitation, and Fuller's career suffered from the controversy. The film was actually banned in Finland and heavily censored elsewhere due to its brutal depiction of asylum conditions. But today, filmmakers from Scorsese to Tarantino celebrate Fuller's audacious vision. The scene where the hospital corridors flood during a storm, patients sliding across the wet floors in a chaotic ballet of madness, remains one of the most visually striking moments of 60s cinema. Fuller doesn't just show you insanity, he makes you feel it. Number 9. The Innocents, 1961. The Innocents isn't just the greatest ghost story of the 1960s. It's a masterclass in psychological horror that makes modern scary movies look like amateur hour. Based on Henry James' The Turn of the Screw, this British chiller stars Deborah Kerr as a governess convinced that the 2 children in her care are possessed by the spirits of 2 dead servants who engaged in some very inappropriate behavior while alive. Director Jack Clayton and cinematographer Freddie Francis create some of the most beautiful horror imagery ever put on screen. Shot in CinemaScope with deep focus that allows you to see figures lurking in distant shadows, the film pioneered techniques that would define the genre. The use of natural sound instead of musical stings creates a disquieting atmosphere where silence becomes terrifying. Those creepy kids you see in modern horror? They all owe a debt to Martin Stevens' performance as Miles, a child who speaks and behaves with disturbing adult knowledge. The film was too sophisticated for 1961 audiences, expecting straightforward scares. 20th Century Fox didn't know how to market a horror film with literary roots and subtle implications of pedophilia and corruption. Critics recognized its brilliance, with Pauline Kael calling it one of the most elegantly beautiful films ever made, but it underperformed at the box office. What makes The Innocents so powerful is its psychological ambiguity. Are there actually ghosts, or is the governess experiencing a sexual repression-induced breakdown? The film never tells you, creating a narrative tension that keeps viewers debating decades later. The scene where Kerr kisses young Miles goodnight, only for him to return it with disturbing adult passion, remains one of the most uncomfortable moments in classic cinema, challenging viewers without explicit content. Number 8. Faces, 1968. John Cassavetes' Faces feels less like watching a movie and more like being trapped in someone else's marriage as it collapses. This raw, uncompromising portrait of middle-class disillusionment follows a middle-aged couple through a night of infidelity, desperation, and emotional violence. Shot on 16mm with harsh lighting in actual homes, the film has the uncomfortable intimacy of a documentary where you're witnessing something you shouldn't be seeing. Cassavetes gave his actors, including his wife, Gena Rowlands, freedom to improvise within scenes that sometimes ran for 30 minutes without cuts. The result is performances of startling authenticity. When characters laugh, it's genuine. When they cry, it's painful. The camera work is equally raw, handheld, grainy, sometimes deliberately unfocused, techniques that would later influence everything from cinema verite to The Office. Faces was made completely outside the studio system on a shoestring budget of $40,000. Cassavetes financed it himself after Hollywood rejected his vision as too experimental. The film took 3 years to complete, with editing happening in Cassavetes' house. Despite these challenges, it became a surprise success, earning 3 Oscar nominations and grossing over $6 million, an indie miracle, in 1968. What makes Faces revolutionary is how it strips away Hollywood artifice to expose the emptiness beneath American prosperity. These characters have achieved the material success they were promised, only to discover it's meaningless. The brutal 14-minute sequence where businessman John Marley brings home prostitute Gina Rowlands, their initial flirtation deteriorating into mutual contempt, feels so real, it's almost unbearable. No filmmaker before Cassavetes had dared to show marriage with such unflattering honesty, and few have matched it since. Number 7. Ride in the Whirlwind, 1966. Ride in the Whirlwind reimagines the Western as an existential nightmare. Directed by Monte Hellman and written by Jack Nicholson, this sparse, haunting film follows 3 cowboys who stop at the wrong cabin, get mistaken for outlaws, and find themselves hunted by vigilantes. What follows is less a traditional Western and more a meditation on fate, chance, and America's frontier justice. Shot back-to-back with the equally brilliant The Shooting in Utah's otherworldly landscapes, the film has a documentary-like quality that strips away Western romanticism. There are no heroic standoffs or noble speeches, just desperate men trying to survive. Hellman's direction is deliberately minimal, with long takes of riders moving through barren terrain, creating a sense of mounting dread. When violence happens, it's sudden, clumsy, and horrifying. The film never received proper theatrical distribution in America. Producer Roger Corman sold it directly to television, where it was largely forgotten until European critics rediscovered it years later. In France, Hellman was hailed as an American auteur, while remaining virtually unknown at home. The film's influence on later revisionist westerns, from McCabe and Mrs. Miller to The Assassination of Jesse James, is immeasurable. Nicholson, still years away from superstardom, delivers a remarkably restrained performance as a cowboy gradually realizing his doom is sealed by mere circumstance. The film's most powerful sequence involves the cowboys taking shelter with a settler family, creating a tense domestic scenario where politeness barely masks terror. When Nicholson's character finally makes his desperate escape attempt, the film reaches a conclusion so bleak and uncompromising that it feels more like 70s cinema than typical 60s fare. This is the Western stripped to its existential bones. Number 6. Accident, 1967. Harold Pinter and Joseph Losey's Accident is a masterpiece of repression, a film where what isn't said is more devastating than what is. Dirk Bogarde plays Stephen, an Oxford professor whose carefully controlled existence unravels when he develops an obsession with a beautiful student who's involved with both his colleague and his student. The film opens with the titular accident, a car crash outside Stephen's countryside home, and then moves backward, revealing the web of desire, jealousy, and deception that led to tragedy. Losey's direction is clinical and precise, using the architecture of Oxford to frame characters as if they're trapped in museum displays. Conversations happen in immaculate rooms where emotion is considered vulgar, yet the atmosphere is charged with unacknowledged lust and resentment. Accident was critically acclaimed in Europe, winning the Grand Jury Prize at Cannes, but American audiences largely ignored it. The film's refusal to explain motivations or provide easy resolution frustrated viewers expecting conventional drama. But this ambiguity is precisely what makes it brilliant. Pinter's screenplay is a masterclass in subtext. Characters engage in mundane discussions about cricket and academics, while psychological warfare unfolds beneath the surface. Bogarde, in his second collaboration with Losey after The Servant, delivers one of cinema's great studies in repressed desire. His Stephen maintains a veneer of academic respectability while internally crumbling with want. The film's most uncomfortable scene, a drunken Sunday lunch where multiple forms of betrayal occur amid polite conversation, exemplifies British class system pathology. When the narrative circles back to the accident itself, the moment of violence feels like the inevitable eruption of everything these characters have worked so hard to suppress. Number 5. Lilith, 1964. Warren Beatty at his most vulnerable and Jean Seberg at her most haunting create a disturbing dance of obsession in Robert Rossen's Lilith. Set in a high-end mental institution, the film follows Vincent, a war veteran who takes a job as an occupational therapist and becomes dangerously enthralled with Lilith, a seductive schizophrenic patient who creates her own mythological world. Rossen, directing his final film while battling terminal illness, creates a visual poetry that mirrors Lilith's fractured perspective. Cinematographer Eugen Schuften uses overexposure, reflective surfaces, and water imagery to create a dreamlike atmosphere where reality and delusion blur. The scenes where Lilith communes with nature, whispering to flowing water and creating spiderweb mandalas, are both beautiful and deeply unsettling. Columbia Pictures had no idea how to market such an unconventional film, especially one that implied a romantic relationship between therapist and patient. Critics were divided, with some praising its artistic ambition while others found it pretentious. The film quietly disappeared after a brief run, despite a supporting cast that included Peter Fonda and Gene Hackman in early roles. What makes Lilith fascinating today is its refusal to pathologize or simplify mental illness. Lilith isn't portrayed as a victim to be saved or a problem to be solved. She's a complex character who finds power in her alternate reality. When Vincent falls under her spell, the traditional dynamic of rational doctor and irrational patient inverts, raising questions about who's actually sick. The film's ambiguous ending, where reality and fantasy become indistinguishable, was decades ahead of its time, influencing later works like Shutter Island and Sucker Punch. Number 4. The Naked Prey, 1965. Cornel Wilde's The Naked Prey strips action cinema down to its primal essence. One man running for his life through the African wilderness with a tribe of warriors in pursuit. Based loosely on the true story of trapper John Coulter's escape from Blackfoot warriors in 1809, the film transplants the narrative to 19th century Africa, where Wilde himself plays a safari guide who becomes human game after his employer insults a local tribe. The film's most remarkable aspect is its lean, almost documentary-like approach. Dialogue is minimal, with long stretches containing no words at all, just the sounds of pursuit, exhaustion, and survival. Wilde, who directed and produced in addition to starring, shot on location in Botswana with a small crew, capturing authentic landscapes rarely seen by Western audiences in the 1960s. At 53 years old during filming, Wilde performed his own grueling stunts, bringing physical authenticity to the character's ordeal. The Naked Prey was moderately successful upon release, but controversial for its violence, which was graphic for 1965. Critics praised its technical achievements, but questioned its racial politics. Modern viewers might find aspects problematic, though the film is more nuanced than many of its contemporaries, showing the European hunters as arrogant intruders whose disrespect triggers the conflict. What elevates the film beyond a simple chase narrative is its increasingly complex portrayal of survival. As Wilde's character endures hunger, exposure, and exhaustion, he develops a grudging respect for his pursuers and the harsh environment. The scene where he shares a moment of connection with a young warrior, despite their inability to communicate verbally, suggests an understanding transcending cultural barriers. The film's influence can be seen in everything from Apocalypto to Mad Max: Fury Road, proving that sometimes cinema is most powerful when stripped to its essential elements. Number 3. The Shooting, 1966. The Shooting is a Western that feels more like a nightmare. Directed by Monty Hellman and starring a young Jack Nicholson, this hypnotic journey follows a group of travelers through an increasingly surreal desert landscape on a mysterious mission that none of them fully understand. The plot seems simple. A former bounty hunter is hired by a strange woman, Millie Perkins, to guide her through the desert. But everything about the journey feels wrong. The woman is secretive and possibly mad. Nicholson appears as a menacing gunslinger who may be working with or against her. The landscape becomes increasingly barren and abstract as they travel, as if they're moving out of the physical world altogether. Shot for approximately $75,000 with a tiny crew in the Utah desert, the film's production was as austere as its setting. Hellman and cinematographer Gregory Sandor create compositions where tiny human figures are dwarfed by vast, indifferent wilderness. The dialogue is sparse and often cryptic, forcing viewers to piece together the mystery themselves. Roger Corman, who financed the film, was reportedly baffled by the final product and barely released it. What makes the shooting so powerful is its gradual transformation from genre film to existential parable. The characters move toward a destination that may not exist, driven by motivations they can't articulate, only to arrive at one of the most shocking and ambiguous endings in American cinema. Warren Oates' performance as the increasingly bewildered guide grounds the film's abstraction in human confusion. When the final revelation comes, it's both incomprehensible and strangely inevitable, like reaching the center of a labyrinth only to find yourself back at the beginning. No Western has ever created such a perfect fusion of frontier mythology and surrealist dread. Number 2. Seconds, 1966. Ever wonder what happens when the director of The Manchurian Candidate makes a sci-fi body horror film? Seconds is John Frankenheimer's most disturbing creation, a nightmare about identity, conformity, and the empty promises of reinvention. Rock Hudson, completely shedding his romantic leading man image, plays a banker who undergoes a radical procedure from a mysterious organization called The Company that gives him a new face, body, and identity as a successful artist. Cinematographer James Wong Howe created some of the most disorienting visuals of the decade using fisheye lenses, bizarre angles, and handheld cameras decades before they became horror staples. The opening sequence, where a man is followed through Grand Central Station, feels more like experimental film than Hollywood product. The plastic surgery sequences, with their clinical detachment and grotesque imagery, presaged body horror directors like Cronenberg. Paramount Pictures had absolutely no idea how to market this film. Audiences expecting typical Rock Hudson charm were confronted with existential dread and graphic surgical imagery. It flopped spectacularly, effectively ending Frankenheimer's hot streak in Hollywood. The film was so ahead of its time that it took decades for critics to recognize its brilliance, with the Criterion Collection eventually giving it the prestige treatment it deserved. What makes Seconds so haunting is how it dismantles the American myth of reinvention. Hudson's character gets everything he thinks he wants: youth, beauty, freedom from responsibility, only to discover that changing your exterior doesn't heal internal emptiness. The wine festival sequence, where he participates in a bacchanalian grape stomping that devolves into a kind of pagan ritual, remains one of the most hallucinatory scenes in mainstream 60s cinema. When the true nature of the company's rebirth process is revealed in the final moments, it's a twist ending so chilling it makes The Twilight Zone look tame. Number 1. Carnival of Souls, 1962. Carnival of Souls is the greatest horror film you've probably never seen. A shoestring budget masterpiece that creates more genuine unease than movies with 100 times its resources. Made for approximately $33,000 by industrial filmmaker Herc Harvey, this eerie nightmare follows Mary Henry, the sole survivor of a car accident, as she relocates to Utah and takes a job as a church organist. But Mary soon finds herself drawn to an abandoned lakeside pavilion while being stalked by a ghostly pale man. Everything about this film's production screams amateur. It was shot with a 3-person crew on weekends, used locations without permits, and features mostly. Non-professional actors. Yet somehow, these limitations create a dreamlike atmosphere where nothing feels quite right. The black and white cinematography has a stark documentary quality that makes the supernatural elements more disturbing. The organ score, composed by Gene Moore, transforms from sacred to profane as it underscores Mary's deteriorating sanity. The film was barely distributed upon completion, playing mostly in drive-ins before falling into the public domain. For years, it circulated in poor-quality prints, becoming a cult oddity rather than a recognized classic. But directors from George Romero to David Lynch have cited it as a major influence, with Lynch's Eraserhead owing a particular debt to its atmospheric horror. What makes Carnival of Souls so effective is its existential dread. Mary doesn't just see ghosts, she experiences a fundamental disconnection from humanity. In the film's most famous sequence, she becomes literally invisible to others around her, unable to be seen or heard despite her increasing desperation. The abandoned pavilion, filled with ghostly dancers in a macabre waltz, creates imagery that lingers long after more explicit horror fades from memory. The film's twist ending has been imitated countless times, but never with the same melancholy power as this accidental masterpiece. The 1960s hid some of cinema's greatest treasures in plain sight. Films too strange, too challenging, or too ahead of their time to be appreciated. From psychological horror to existential westerns, these forgotten classics reveal a decade of filmmaking far more experimental and daring than the blockbusters that overshadowed them. Which of these hidden gems surprised you most? Did we miss any obscure 60s masterpieces that deserve rediscovery? Drop a comment below and tell us which of these films you're adding to your must-watch list. Because in an era of endless remakes and sequels, these originals might just remind us what true cinematic vision looks like.